Hello, welcome to today's edition of the Daf Yomi. Today's Daf is Daf 18 Amud A from Makkos. Let's dive straight in. We go from the previous Amud. The Gemara asked, but then we learn in the Mishnah, and these are the people who are flogged by Torah law. Among them is a priest who eats the first fruit before the recitation of the accompanying Torah verses. And the Gemara established that the Mishnah is according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Rather, the derivation is at the entire verse beginning. You may not eat within your gates the tithe of your grain. Deuteronomy 12:17 is a superfluous verse. Rashi explains that this is based on the understanding that when it is stated in the Vayta that one is flogged based on the derivation from an a fortiori inference, it means that performing such an action is prohibited. It does not mean that one is liable to receive lashes. Now, as the earlier statement, one is flogged 5 sets of lashes must be understood in that manner. The Gemara here seeks to understand the Mishnah. Why, according to Rabbi Shimon, is one liable to receive lashes for eating first food before the recitation of the accompanying 12 verses? In light of the principle, one does not derive a prohibition by means of an a fortiori inference. The Gemara answers that this halach is not derived by means of a fortiori inference, as stated in the Brayta. Rather, it is derived based on the principle: if the verse is not relevant to one matter, apply it to a different matter. Likewise, one is not flogged for the other halachot derived in the Brayta by means of a fortiori inference, except for the prohibition against eating the flesh of offerings of the most sacred order outside the curtains of the tabernacle courtyard, which is derived from a different verse: of any flesh torn of animals in the field you shall not eat, in Exodus 22:30. Other early commentaries maintain that the Gemara at this point retracts its assertion that the word flogged in this context means that there is a prohibition, yet there is no actual liability to receive lashes. Instead, the Gemara maintains that, according to Rabbi Shimon, one is in fact liable to receive lashes for those prohibitions derived in the Brayta, although they appear to be derived by means of a fortiori inferences. The reason is that the halacha itself is not actually derived by means of a fortiori inference. Rather, it's derived from a superfluous verse or through juxtaposition of the matters. The Brayta stated that a fortiori inferences only to facilitate additional analysis. Alternatively, the reason one is flogged is that the prohibitions are not actually derived from these a fortiori inferences. Instead, it is by means of these inferences the meaning of these prohibitions is revealed. See Tosfot, the explanation of Rambam and Ritva. This is apparently understanding according to the Rambam as well. After all, it is already written, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices and your tithe and the donation of your hand and your vows and your gift offerings and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock, and there you shall eat before the Lord your God. In Deuteronomy 12:6-7. All the items that must be eaten within the walls of Jerusalem are enumerated. Let the most ones write simply, you may not eat them, in general terms, which will constitute a prohibition for which one would be liable to receive lashes for each of the cases enumerated. Why do you need the merciful one to again specifically enumerate and detail each of them? Rather, this repetition should to designate additional prohibitions for each and every one of the cases enumerated later in the verse. Deuteronomy 12:17. The prohibition is derived not by means of an a fortiori inference, rather it is derived from a superfluous verse. Rabbi Shimon derives by means of the inferences the additional prohibition that is in effect in each of these cases. With regard to the matter itself, Rabbi says, with regard to a non-priest who ate flesh of a burnt offering before sprinkling its blood outside the walls, according to Rabbi Shimon, he is flogged with 5 sets of lashes. The Gemara suggests, let him also be flogged for violating prohibition, and the non-priest may not eat as they are sacred, in Exodus 29:33. This verse is stated with regard to the offerings sacrificed as part of the inauguration of Aaron and his sons as priests in the tabernacle. The addition of the phrase "as they are sacred" teaches that there is a special prohibition with regard to the flesh of offerings of the most sacred order. The Gemara explains this matter prohibiting a non-priest from eating consecrated food applies only in a case where the food is fit for consumption by priests. The reason that it is written at the beginning of that verse, they shall eat them, that with which they were atoned, Exodus 29:30, indicating that the prohibition against a non-priest partaker of sacrificial food applies only when he eats it, in circumstances where it is permitted, and in fact a mitzvah for a priest to eat it. The Gemara explains, this matter prohibiting a non-priest from eating consecrated food applies only in a case where the food is fit for consumption by a priest. Here, where the food is not fit for consumption by a priest either, as it is not permitted for anyone to partake of a burnt offering, there is no specific prohibition that applies to a non-priest. The Gemara suggests, and let him also be flogged for violating prohibition. And any flesh torn of animals in the field you shall not eat. This is 22:30. From the term in the field, a general halacha is derived. Once the flesh emerged, the term in the field in its content is superfluous, as a straightforward understanding of the verse that the flesh of a terei, i.e. an animal with a wound that will cause it to die within 12 months is forbidden, applies elsewhere. Therefore, it is interpreted that the prohibition you may not eat within your gates in its context applies to any item that has emerged beyond its partition, although it is situated in a field without partition, says Rashi. With partition and is in the field. E.g., sacrificial meat that was taken outside the tabernacle curtains that demarcate the courtyard, there is a prohibition and the flesh is forbidden. The Gemara explains, this matter, the prohibition against eating sacrificial flesh outside the partition and the temple courtyard applies only in a case where the flesh is fit for consumption inside the courtyard. Even in the case of a burnt offering, the flesh is not fit for consumption inside the courtyard either. It is not permitted for anyone to partake of a burnt offering. This is the prohibition that applies to a non-priest partaking of the flesh outside the courtyard. The Gemara says, and let him also be flogged in accordance with the din of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says that when it is stated with regard to leftover flesh and loaves from the inaugural offerings, we should not be eaten because it is sacred. Exodus 29:34. Thank you for listening and all the best. Bye.